Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for spending part of your day here at the Sixth Floor Museum. I'm Stephen Fagan, the curator, and with President's Day just around the corner, we wanted to devote this week's Friday Gallery Talk to a look at presidential visits to Dallas over the past 120 years, going all the way back to President Theodore Roosevelt. And we have with us a very special guest today, a Dallas historian and genealogist, Dr. Stephen R. Butler. I've known Dr. Butler for many years. He's a prominent local historian, a retired history professor at two local schools, Dallas College, Richland, and Collin County College. And he's also the author of about a dozen books. And he's actually going to be here today talking about his latest book, which you can see up on the screen here, about presidential visits to Dallas, including the most famous one, which is why you're all here today, President Kennedy's ill-fated trip to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. In fact, the title of Dr. Butler's book, "You Can't Say Dallas Doesn't Love You, Mr. President," that's a quotation spoken by the First Lady of Texas, Nellie Connally, to President Kennedy right outside this building as the motorcade was on Houston Street approaching Elm Street. So it's very appropriate to have him here today. And I just learned downstairs a few minutes ago that Dr. Butler is related to multiple presidents, distantly related to multiple U.S. presidents. So we are in the presence of greatness today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Butler to talk with us today.
Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon, rather. Before I begin, I'd like to tell you that I've been interested in presidential history since 1960, when I was 11 years old, and John F. Kennedy was running for office against Richard M. Nixon. In keeping with that lifelong, or nearly lifelong interest, over the years, I've gone out of my way to visit 6 presidential libraries, 9 presidents' homes or birthplaces, including Mount Vernon and Monticello, 11 presidents' graves, and I've seen 5 actual presidents in person. Of course, I've seen the White House and Air Force One, including that version of that plane in which John F. Kennedy arrived here in Dallas in 1963. I also collect presidential campaign badges and campaign ephemera, things like posters and bumper stickers and things like that. And believe it or not, as Stephen has already told you, I can also say with truth that I am distantly related to Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Harry S. Truman, both Bushes, and Barack Obama. In light of all this, you probably won't be surprised to hear that as a historian and native of Dallas, I am particularly interested in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I honestly cannot remember how many times I visited both this museum and Dealey Plaza, even before there was a museum in this building. I've also gone out of my way to visit several sites associated with the assassination and the alleged assassin, including the house in which Lee Harvey Oswald spent the night before the assassination, the movie theater where he was apprehended, the jail cell in which he was kept, and the spot where Jack Ruby shot him, as well as his grave at Rose Hill Cemetery in Fort Worth. And so for all those reasons, I feel both honored and privileged to be able to speak to you today here at the Sixth Floor Museum on the eve of President's Day 2025. So let me begin. Back in 2013, for the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, I wrote an article in haste that I hoped would be published in Legacies, a history journal for Dallas and North Central Texas. It wasn't, because, as the editor told me, it was evident that I had written it in haste. Consequently, it became the only article I've ever written with legacies in mind that was turned down. A little more than 2 years ago, as the 60th anniversary of the assassination approached, I decided to get that article out of hibernation, so to speak, to see if I could fix it up so that it was worthy of publication. Unfortunately, as I reworked it and added to it, it became evident to me that it was going to be way too long for Legacies. That's when I decided to publish it myself as a book, which you can now purchase online from Amazon.com or here at the 6th Floor Museum downstairs in the gift shop. So, what's this book about? Well, it came about as a result of a question I asked myself one day. How many presidents have visited Dallas in addition to John F. Kennedy? Turns out there have been 21 so far, including JFK, who of all those many presidents was the only one to be killed here. My research also revealed that Kennedy himself visited Dallas on 4 previous occasions before 1963, and not only left safe and sound, but was greeted warmly. So, in addition to being a chronological narrative of all the presidential visits to Dallas that have ever occurred through 2023, the purpose of my book is to serve as a counterpoint to all those accusations that have been made over the years that Dallas is or was a city of hate. Of all those presidential visits, only one ended badly. And even that one can't be attributed to the ordinary citizens of Dallas, who came out in droves to line the streets, to cheer and wave as President Kennedy and his wife Jackie went by in a motorcade, prompting the wife of the governor of Texas, Nellie Connolly, who was riding in the front seat of the presidential limo with her husband, to turn to President Kennedy and say, just as they were about to turn the corner onto Elm Street in front of this building, "You can't say Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President." And that is why I chose that title for my book. So, Stephen told you that Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to visit Dallas. Or was he? Well, turns out it depends on how you ask the question. Do you mean a former president, a future president, or a sitting president? Well, if you're not particular, it was actually Harry Truman. Harry S. Truman, as a 17-year-old lad, came to Dallas in 1901, very briefly. It wasn't a presidential visit, obviously. He was years and years away from becoming president. But he lived in Missouri, by the way, if you didn't know that already. And the Truman family had some relatives who lived in Greenville out here in Hunt County, which is a few miles east of Dallas. So they were on their way to visit their relatives. And now, because of the way the trains were set up in those days, there were no direct trains to Greenville from Missouri. So you had to come to Dallas and change trains. So Truman wasn't here very long, just long enough to change trains. And of course, when they left and went back home to Missouri, they had to come to Dallas again. So it's a little of a trivial question, perhaps, but it was actually Harry Truman, first one to get here. And by coincidence, and I've found this really astonishing when I discovered this, September the 6th, 1901, which is the day he arrived, was the same day that William McKinley was shot and killed by Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. So that was probably in the headlines. If not that day, then certainly the next day when the Trumans arrived here in Texas. But the first sitting president to come to Dallas was, in fact, Theodore Roosevelt, who arrived here in April 1905, April 5th. He had just been elected in his own right. He became president because of McKinley's assassination. He was vice president at the time. And by the way, here's another trivial question. A lot of people will sometimes ask, who was the youngest president? Well, it depends on how you word the question. Who was the youngest president when they got elected, or who was the youngest president when they were actually taking office? If you say who was the youngest elected president, it would be John F. Kennedy. But if you say who was the youngest president, it was Theodore Roosevelt, because he didn't get elected to the presidency the first time around. He was vice president and ascended to the presidency on account of McKinley's assassination. But he was elected in his own right in 1904. He was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1905, which is when they used to have presidential inaugurations in those days. And he said not long after that, he said, I'm going to go take a trip to Texas. And so he came to Texas. Now, he wasn't coming specifically to Dallas. He was actually on his way to San Antonio. Does anybody happen to know why Theodore Roosevelt would want to go to San Antonio? Does anybody know anything about his life that has some connection to San Antonio? No? You ever heard of the Rough Riders? I bet you have. If you've ever taken a U.S. history lesson, you learned that during the Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt was the colonel in charge of a group of soldiers who were called the Rough Riders, who, by the way, should actually be called the Rough Runners. You know why? Because when he and his regiment shipped out to Cuba in 1898, only the officers were allowed to take their horses with them to Cuba. And so the enlisted men had no horses when they got to Cuba. And so when they charged up San Juan Hill, Roosevelt was the only one on a horse. All the rest of them were on foot. But by the way, and here's another little trivial nugget of knowledge. His horse was called Little Texas. And the reason he called his horse Little Texas is because that's where he got his horse. He bought it from a horse breeder near San Antonio, Texas, which is where the Rough Riders trained as a cavalry unit before they shipped out for Cuba. So anyway, but to get back to Dallas, so the president came down to Texas to have a reunion with his old Army buddies, the Rough Riders in San Antonio, Texas. And they chose that city because that's the city near which they trained back in 1898. So Dallas was on the way there. And so he stopped at a lot of places along the way. He had a special presidential train called the Rocket, and because it went really fast. And he stopped, he crossed the Red River, and he came into Texas. He stopped at he stopped at Denison, then Sherman, then McKinney, then Plano, Richardson, and then finally he got to Dallas, where he was met by crowds of people, given a parade through the streets, and put up at the Oriental Hotel, and gave a big speech outside to the public. And later on, he was treated to a grand dinner with all the bigwigs of Dallas at that time, and made another speech. And he was very popular, which is quite interesting because does anybody know what party Theodore Roosevelt belonged to? Was he a Republican or a Democrat? He was a Republican. And Texas in those days was mostly Democrat, but they loved him anyway. And they gave him a very warm welcome, as they have all the presidents that have come here over the years. Well, Theodore Roosevelt left office in 1909, and in 1911, he decided he was going to run for president again. He thought that telling people back in 1904, after he won the presidency in his own right, he thought that telling people he wasn't going to run again in 1908 was a bad decision that he had made on the spur of the moment. So he decided to challenge his successor, William Howard Taft, for the presidency in 1912. And when he didn't get the Republican nomination, he started his own party. Does anybody know what it was called? No? Okay, this is the teacher and me coming out. That's why I'm asking you all these questions. Well, it was called the Bull Moose Party, or at least that was its nickname. Anyway, and by the way, he didn't win that election, but he came in second place, which is the only time a third-party candidate has ever beaten a candidate from one of the two major political parties. William Howard Taft, who ran as the Republican nominee, came in third. And the guy who came in at the top, who actually won the presidency, was one of the people that you'll see in this next slide. Oh, no, you won't. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But you will see them eventually. Now, the next president to visit Dallas was, in fact, William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt's successor, hand-picked successor, as it turned out. And he is famous as president for having a special bathtub built for him in the White House, because he was a rather large fellow. He was quite tall, and I forget how much he weighed, but it was an awful lot. So they had to make a special bathtub for him. They also had to reinforce the chairs that he sat in. He was so heavy. In any case, he arrived here in Dallas by train on October 23rd, 1909, and he departed safely the next day. So the president himself was never in any actual danger, but to make sure the mayor of Dallas, Mayor Barry, B-A-R-R-Y, decided to call out the National Guard and line the streets. The reason they did this is because they remembered what happened to McKinley back in 1901, and this is only 8 years later. So they didn't want to take any chances with the president's safety. So when the president rode through the streets, they had the National Guard, the Texas division of the National Guard, lining the parade route over by Fair Park, if you know where that is. And so the president was never in any danger, but apparently one of the citizens was, because, as it says here, one of the National Guardsmen got a little overzealous. There was a fellow named Louis Reichenstein who wanted to cross the street where the president's car was due to come at almost any minute. And when he ducked under, they had like a wire or a rope or something strung up, tied to a lamppost, strung up to try to hold people back. When he ducked under that and started out across the street, a National Guardsman got a little, like I say, overexcited, and he stabbed him with his bayonet on the end of his rifle, and wounded him mortally. And that's his grave in Greenwood Cemetery here in Dallas. Okay. The next few presidents came here not as sitting presidents, but as future or former presidents. Woodrow Wilson spoke at the Fair Park Coliseum, which was for a long time, not anymore, the Women's Museum. Warren G. Harding came here in 1920. He was not yet in office, but about to be. And the following year, he spoke at Dallas City Hall, and Calvin Coolidge came here and arrived at Union Station, where a crowd of people came down to see him. And he was the president who was a man of many words, a man of few words. Have you ever heard about that? That he didn't like to, you wouldn't expect any long speeches from Calvin Coolidge. He was a man, he was very spare with his words. And there's a story about Coolidge, I don't know if you've ever heard this, that at a dinner party in the White House, this woman was seated next to him. She managed to get herself seated next to the president in hopes of engaging him in some sort of conversation. And as try as hard as she could, she just couldn't get him to talk a lot or to say much of anything at all, or anything at all. And finally, out of frustration, she said, "Mr. President," she said, "I made a bet with a friend who knew I was coming here to the dinner at the White House tonight. I made a bet that I could get you to say more than 2 words. And Coolidge reportedly turned to her and said, "You lose." Herbert Hoover was the president after Calvin Coolidge. The man who came to office at a very inopportune time, just as the Great Depression was getting underway. and as a consequence only served one term. But Dallasites had to wait until 1956 to see him. And even then, he only came the one time. He gave a speech, he gave a press conference, as it says here, at Statler Hilton, and then spoke to a gathering of lawyers, invitation only, to SMU's McFarland Auditorium. And Mayor R.L. Thornton, for whom R.L. Thornton Freeway is named, made him an honorary citizen of Dallas. In 1936, Hoover's successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came to Dallas for the occasion of the Texas Centennial Exposition. If you're from Dallas, you probably know already that we have a big park just a few miles east of here called Fair Park. It is the largest intact World's Fair site in the United States, or reasonably intact. It's not all there, but most of it. And it was called the Texas Centennial Exposition in 1936, and President Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor were invited to come and give a speech in the Cotton Bowl, and there he is giving a speech in the Cotton Bowl that was broadcast on radio nationally. So you could tune in on this speech no matter where you lived if you had a radio set in those days. And then after he gave his speech, they drove him out to what was then called Oaklawn Park, but later became known as Lee Park because they erected a statue of Robert E. Lee, General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. I'm sure you all know who he was, very famous in American history. And President Roosevelt unveiled it on that occasion and gave another much shorter speech. That statue, by the way, has since been removed. Just a few years ago, when the move began to remove Confederate monuments from various public places, that statue was taken down, and if I'm not mistaken, was sold to a private individual, and I'm not sure what they've done with it. And the park has been renamed Turtle Creek Park. Now, here's an interesting thing about Turtle Creek Park. Even though the statue of Robert E. Lee is not there anymore, there's a replica of Robert E. Lee's home at Arlington in Virginia, which sits in the middle of Arlington National Cemetery, overlooking Washington. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. It's one of the better known stories about, well, it isn't really about the assassination as such, as about a version of it, let's put it that way. But anyway, it was a big box office hit back in the 1990s, and several scenes in the movie, including in front of this building in Dealey Plaza, were filmed here in Dallas, including this scene that you see here. There's a scene where Kevin Costner, the actor Kevin Costner, who played an attorney named Jim Garrison, stands in front of John F. Kennedy's grave. Well, I remember watching this movie, and I've been to Arlington National Cemetery, and I recognized right away that that building behind was not the actual Arlington house that Robert E. Lee had lived in. Here's the actual house here, It has big, tall columns that kind of made out of a stone that has swirls in it, different colors of stone. And this one is just white. And so you can see that even though that's a pretty good replica of John F. Kennedy's grave, that building behind it is not in Arlington, Virginia, but rather Dallas, Texas. The next president to come to Dallas after Franklin Roosevelt was Harry Truman, again. Only this time he wasn't a 17-year-old kid, he was the president of the United States. And he was campaigning for president in the 1948 election. He arrived in Fort Worth, motored over to Dallas and made some stops along the way. And then went to a place that was then called Rebel Stadium, later called Burnett Field, over in Oak Cliff. It's not there anymore, but it was a big baseball stadium and held a lot of people, a lot of seats, and so they had a campaign rally there. What made that campaign stop so notable was that this was in Texas, okay, in the 1940s. Texas was one of the southern states that was racially segregated in those days. But Truman, who was a champion of civil rights, made sure that African Americans who came to his rally at Rebel Stadium were allowed to sit anywhere they wanted, and they did. So that was quite remarkable for the time, and a lot of people said that it was more likely to lose Truman votes in the 1948 election. But he still managed to win and became president again in 1949. Truman is one of the few presidents to come back to Dallas several times. He came back again, as you can see there, in 1957, 58, 59, and 61. And on the last occasion, he spoke at the Elmwood Methodist Church. This is a picture of him speaking there. Now, what about President Eisenhower? Well, President Eisenhower came to Dallas twice in 1952 as a Republican nominee for president, and every time he got a parade through downtown Dallas in an open-top car, and he gave speeches and was very popular. Largely because he had helped win World War II by being the Supreme Allied Commander of the European theater and helping to plan the D-Day invasion and directing that. And so he was very popular, and they had buttons that were had a real short but catchy slogan, "I like Ike." However, he was supposed to come back later on in 1956, and he actually had a stop scheduled here, but he had to cancel it. So he never did come back again. Oh, and here's another little trivial tidbit. Eisenhower was the first president from Texas. But you know what? When he was applying to go to West Point, he grew up in Kansas, by the way. He was born here in Texas, in Denison, which is about an hour and a half north of here. He was born in Denison, but he was raised in Kansas, and he never remembered being here in Texas because he was an infant at the time. When he was making out his application to go to West Point, on birthplace, he wrote Kansas. His mother said, "Oh, no, son, scratch that out. you were born in Texas. He said, really? I don't remember that. She said, well, I do. And you were born in Denison, Texas in 1890. So now you know. Now let's talk about John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy visited Dallas more than once. A lot of people think he only came here in 1963 one time, and that's it. But he didn't. He came here, in fact, 5 times. 5 times. A couple, 2 or 3 times as a senator, and later on as a president as well, as a sitting president as well. So let's take a look at those 5 visits. October 25th, 1956, he and Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas, who would later become vice president and president himself, arrived at Love Field to campaign for the Democratic nominee of that year, Adlai Stevenson. He came here again in 1957, also as a senator, and he gave a speech at Memorial Auditorium for the Texas State Teachers Association. And once again, Lyndon Johnson was on hand and introduced him. And then September 13th, 1960, as Democratic candidate for president, Kennedy gave a campaign speech at Memorial Auditorium. He traveled in a motorcade from Fort Worth, just like Truman had done, down the same highway, came through, and here's what I think is really interesting. The motorcade took him past Rose Hill Cemetery. And who did I say was buried there? Oswald. Of course, he wasn't buried there then, obviously, but he would be in the future. Anyway, President Kennedy came through Grand Prairie, made a stop in Grand Prairie, made a stop in Arlington, came to Dallas, and he came up through the triple underpass up here on Commerce Street. Now we have Elm Street right in front of this building. The next street over is Main, and then they got Commerce. So Elm is one way going that way, Main Street's 2-way, and Commerce is one way heading east. And so he was headed east on Commerce Street, came right through, came right through Dealey Plaza. There's Elm Street. There's the building we're in right now. And over here is Commerce Street. And I can't help but wonder, did he see that building? Did he see this building as he drove past? I don't know. Okay, let's kind of wrap things up here. October 9th, 1961, as a sitting president, JFK flew to Dallas, as it says here, to visit former Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, who was dying of cancer at Baylor Hospital. He also stopped to talk to some of the other patients. Then his 5th visit, November 22nd, 1963, with his wife, Jackie. They spent the night in Fort Worth. They had visited other Texas cities before they got here. And they were accompanied by President Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird. Vice President. Did I say President? Anyway, Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, who got in the limousine with them, and they headed for downtown. Along the way, they were greeted by enthusiastic, friendly crowds. And as they turned on Elm Street, as I've already pointed out, and Stephen did too, Nellie Connally turned around in her seat to look at John F. Kennedy and said, "Dallas, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President, because all along the way there were all these friendly, wonderful people. But as it's often said, the rest is history. And so how are we doing for time, Stephen?
We're actually at the end. If you want to take a couple of questions, they can find out about the rest with
By reading my book, yeah. Okay, so I didn't really think I was going to make it through all 21 presidents in just a few moments. But if you want to buy my book and read more, you'll find out about that. I'll just say one thing, though. We once had 5 presidents here, all at the same time. Now, they weren't all in office at the same time, but in 2013, when the George W. Bush Library was dedicated over near SMU, we had 5 presidents, both Bushes, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, who was then in office. And they all came here. None of them ever came to harm. And that, again, is the point of my book. We've had presidents here many, many times on multiple occasions. And all but one time, it's been pretty good for them.